The Vietnam War has a start date, at least that's what the history books say. August 1964, the Gulf of Tonkin. Resolutions, speeches, and a sudden sense that something new had begun. But buried in casualty lists and forgotten after action reports are American names that predate all of that. Men who died in Vietnam years before the war was supposed to exist. They were not called soldiers at war, they were called advisors, trainers, observers, technical assistants. Words chosen carefully because words decide whether something is a war or merely a policy. These men rode along on patrols. They lived in South Vietnamese units. They were ambushed on jungle roads, killed by landmines, shot during firefights that officially did not count as combat. When they died, there were no speeches, no declarations, often not even public acknowledgement. Their deaths existed in a bureaucratic gray zone, too early to matter, too inconvenient to explain, too dangerous to admit. So the question is not when the Vietnam War began. The question is why some American deaths were allowed to happen before anyone was willing to say the war had started at all. To understand how Americans were dying in Vietnam before the Vietnam War existed, you have to rewind past helicopters and jungle firefights to a quieter, colder moment in history. The late 1940s and early 1950s were not shaped by Vietnam alone, but by fear. Fear that the collapse of one country would pull others down with it, like dominoes tipping across a map. After World War II, France tried to reclaim its colonial control over Indochina. It failed. By 1954, French forces were defeated, and Vietnam was split at the 17th parallel. The North was communist, the South was fragile, unstable, and heavily dependent on outside support to survive. The United States stepped in cautiously, at least on paper. The Korean War had ended badly in the public imagination, and another declared ground war in Asia was politically radioactive. But doing nothing was also unacceptable, so a compromise emerged. America would help, but it would not fight, not officially. Aid flowed in the form of money, equipment, and advisors. These advisors were meant to train South Vietnamese forces, improve logistics, and provide guidance. They were not supposed to engage in combat. That distinction mattered enormously in Washington, even if it meant very little in the countryside of South Vietnam. Because insurgencies do not respect labels. By the late 1950s, communist guerrillas were already active in the South. Ambushes, assassinations, and sabotage were common. South Vietnamese units were fighting for survival, and American advisors were increasingly embedded with them. The line between training and participation grew thinner by the month. But officially, the United States was not at war. There were no combat units deployed, no declarations made, just a growing number of Americans operating in hostile territory, wearing uniforms, carrying weapons, and living with the reality that they could be killed at any time. And some of them were. Before Tonkin, before escalation, before anyone admitted what was already happening on the ground, the war had begun. It just did not have a name yet. On paper, an American advisor in Vietnam during the late 1950s and early 1960s had a narrowly defined job. Train South Vietnamese troops, improve staff planning, observe operations, and report back up the chain. They were not supposed to lead units, call in fire support, or engage the enemy directly. That distinction mattered deeply in Washington because it preserved the claim that the United States was not fighting a war. On the ground, that distinction collapsed almost immediately. Advisors did not operate from safe classrooms or rear area offices. They lived with South Vietnamese units, ate the same food, slept in the same compounds, and moved along the same roads that insurgents were already mining and ambushing. Training often happened in the field, during live operations, because that was where South Vietnamese commanders needed help most. When a patrol moved out, the advisor usually went with it, not because doctrine demanded it, but because without him, the mission often fell apart. Radios malfunctioned, planning broke down, units froze under fire. Advisors were there to fix problems in real time, which meant they were present when things went wrong. And things went wrong frequently. Ambushes happened whether the American in the column was officially a combatant or not. Mines do not discriminate between advisors and soldiers. When firefights erupted, advisors returned fire because the alternative was dying. Afterward, reports were written carefully, describing the incident in language that preserved the fiction of non-combat involvement. This was not accidental. It was policy by omission. Advisors carried weapons. They wore uniforms. They were assigned to units operating in contested areas. Yet their presence was framed as technical assistance, not military engagement. When casualties occurred, they were often described as a result of accidents, banditry, or hostile action unrelated to a larger war. This created a strange and dangerous limbo. Advisors were exposed to combat conditions without the legal, political, or public recognition that came with being at war. There were no clear rules of engagement tailored to their reality, no public accounting of risk, no acknowledgement that the United States had already crossed a line it pretended did not exist. For the men on the ground, the contradiction was obvious. They knew they were operating in hostile territory. They knew they were targets. The only people pretending otherwise were thousands of miles away. By the end of the 1950s, the advisory mission had quietly transformed into something else entirely. American personnel were no longer just teaching tactics. They were participating in a conflict that had already claimed lives. The only thing missing was honesty. And that absence would shape everything that followed. On July 8, 1959, the war announced to Americans in 1964 was already taking bodies. That night, at a military assistance advisory group compound in Bien Hoa, northeast of Saigon, a small number of U.S. advisors gathered in a mess hall to watch a movie. It wasn't a battlefield scene, no sweeping operation, no headline event, just men off duty in a country the United States insisted was only assisting. Viet Cong guerrillas attacked the compound and raked the mess hall with automatic fire. 2 Americans were killed, Major Dale R. Buis and Master Sergeant Chester M. Obnand. 2 South Vietnamese guards were also killed in the attack. The details are painfully ordinary, which is exactly why the moment matters. This wasn't a dramatic beginning, it was an early warning shot, quiet, targeted, and real. Buis and Obnand were widely cited as the first Americans killed in the American phase of the Vietnam conflict, and the official framing around their deaths showed the contradiction at the center of this story. Americans could be killed by an organized insurgency in Vietnam, and the United States could still insist it wasn't at war. This was the pattern in its earliest form. Keep the labels, avoid the word war, treat each death as isolated, because once you admit the obvious, that Americans are being targeted and killed, then the entire policy stops being advice and starts being something else. And by July 1959, something else had already begun. After the first Americans were killed at Bien Hoa on July 8, 1959, the cost of early U.S. involvement in Vietnam did not vanish into obscurity, but it also did not immediately force a national reckoning. In the years that followed, additional advisors died under circumstances that reflected a conflict already unfolding on the ground, even if it was not yet widely acknowledged in Washington or the press. One of the earliest known fatalities after the Bien Hoa attack occurred on September 1, 1961, when Technical Sergeant Richard B. Fitzgibbon, Jr. was shot and killed by a fellow airman while stationed in South Vietnam. Fitzgibbon's death is often left out of Vietnam War casualty lists because it was classified at the time as a homicide unrelated to hostile action. It was only decades later, after concerted reviews by historians and veteran families, that Fitzgibbon was retroactively recognized by the Department of Defense as a Vietnam War casualty, and as one of the earliest American deaths tied to U.S. presence there. Those early deaths, Bien Hoa in 1959, Fitzgibbon in 1961, illustrate a pattern. American personnel were being killed in and around Vietnam, or as a direct result of their service there, years before the Gulf of Tonkin resolution or the huge troop deployments that later defined the Vietnam War. At the time, these incidents did not create headlines or broad public debate. Some were initially classified under categories that obscured their connection to hostile action. Others occurred in support roles that policymakers felt justified describing as assistance rather than combat. The result was a scatter of individual losses that rarely drew sustained attention on their own. For families, this ambiguity often added to the anguish. Notifications were terse, official language was disciplined, public recognition was delayed or absent, and because each incident stood alone in the public record, it was easy for the broader pattern to remain invisible. Yet, taken together, these early deaths reveal that Americans were dying in Vietnam long before the war was officially acknowledged, not as a single flashpoint, but as a series of engagements, accidents, and missions that carried real risk and real cost. The war hadn't been named yet, but it had already claimed lives. The organization most responsible for placing Americans in harm's way before the Vietnam War officially began did not look like a combat command. Its name sounded administrative, almost harmless. The Military Assistance Advisory Group, or MAG, was supposed to do exactly what the title suggested: advise. The U.S. Military Assistance Advisory Group officially began operating in South Vietnam on November 1, 1955, nearly 9 years before the Gulf of Tonkin resolution. MAG had existed in various forms since the early Cold War, helping Allied nations train and organize their armed forces. In Vietnam, its mission expanded steadily as the situation on the ground deteriorated. What began as classroom instruction and logistical guidance evolved into something far more dangerous. Advisors were embedded directly with South Vietnamese units, often at battalion or company level. They helped plan operations, accompanied patrols, evaluated performance, and relayed intelligence. In theory, they were observers. In practice, they were inseparable from combat operations. This was not accidental mission creep. South Vietnamese forces relied heavily on American expertise, especially in communications, artillery coordination, and air support. When an operation went badly, it was often the advisor who understood how to recover it. When a unit hesitated under fire, the advisor was usually standing right there. As insurgent activity increased, MAG personnel found themselves operating farther from secure areas. They traveled along roads that were routinely ambushed. They flew in aircraft that drew enemy fire. They worked in regions where American presence was no secret to the insurgents operating there. Yet MAG remained an advisory organization on paper. That distinction mattered enormously. It allowed the United States to expand its footprint without formally committing combat forces. It preserved the illusion of restraint, even as American involvement deepened. When MAG advisors were killed, their deaths were absorbed into this framework. They were advisors who had died while assisting an ally, not soldiers killed in action during a war. The classification protected policy, but it did nothing to protect the people executing it. By the early 1960s, MAG had become the backbone of U.S. involvement in Vietnam. It placed Americans into combat conditions without calling them combatants. It allowed a war to grow incrementally, shielded by careful language and controlled casualty reporting. And as MAG expanded, so did the number of Americans dying in a conflict that still officially did not exist. Alongside the military advisory effort, another American presence existed in Vietnam long before the war was publicly acknowledged. It operated quietly, largely out of sight, and with far less transparency than the uniformed military. The CIA was active in Vietnam well before large-scale U.S. troop deployments, supporting political, intelligence, and counterinsurgency efforts during the 1950s and early 1960s. These activities were part of a broader Cold War strategy focused on containing communist influence without triggering open conflict. Intelligence officers worked with South Vietnamese officials, gathered information, and supported programs intended to stabilize the government and disrupt insurgent networks. Much of this work was classified, not because it was unusual for intelligence agencies, but because open acknowledgement would have complicated U.S. claims of limited involvement. The CIA's role did not replace the military advisory mission. It existed alongside it, often overlapping in purpose but operating under different authorities and reporting structures. This separation mattered. Military advisors wore uniforms and were officially assigned to MAG. Intelligence personnel did not. Their activities were governed by secrecy rather than doctrine. Because of this, the public record of early CIA involvement in Vietnam is incomplete by design. Declassified documents and later historical studies confirm that intelligence operations were underway, but details remain fragmented. This lack of visibility reinforced the broader illusion that the United States was not yet deeply engaged in the conflict. What is more important is not what cannot be proven, but what can. The CIA's early presence contributed to a layered approach in Vietnam. Military advisors provided training and operational support, while intelligence personnel worked to shape the political and security environment behind the scenes. Together, these efforts represented a level of involvement far beyond what the word assistant suggested. For Americans on the ground, these distinctions offered little protection. Insurgent forces did not differentiate between uniforms and civilian clothes, between advisors and intelligence officers. All represented foreign involvement in a conflict already underway. The combination of advisory missions and intelligence operations allowed U.S. policymakers to influence events while delaying public accountability. By keeping these efforts compartmentalized and partially classified, Washington could claim restraint even as American exposure increased. This was not a conspiracy, and it was not unique to Vietnam. It was a familiar Cold War method. Incremental involvement paired with careful language. But in Vietnam, it meant that Americans were operating in danger long before the country was prepared to admit the risks it had already accepted. While American officials debated language and policy, the insurgents fighting in South Vietnam did not share the confusion. To them, the presence of Americans in uniform or working alongside government forces was proof enough that the United States had entered the conflict. Labels like advisor or intelligence officer did not matter. Targets were targets. By the late 1950s, the Viet Cong had already begun identifying American personnel as high-value objectives. Attacking them served multiple purposes. It disrupted South Vietnamese operations, demonstrated reach, and sent a message that foreign involvement would not go unanswered. Ambushes involving American advisors were not random. Roads used by advisory teams were monitored. Patterns were studied. When an opportunity presented itself, insurgent forces acted decisively. These attacks were planned with the understanding that killing Americans carried political weight, even if that weight was being deliberately minimized by Washington. From the insurgent perspective, the war was already underway. The South Vietnamese government was propped up by foreign support. American advisors were embedded at key levels. Intelligence and counterinsurgency operations were actively targeting communist networks. There was no illusion of neutrality to preserve. This asymmetry in acknowledgement created a dangerous imbalance. The insurgents escalated tactics, while American policy remained constrained by its own denial. Advisors faced increasing risk without corresponding changes in protection, rules of engagement, or force posture. The enemy adapted faster than the policy framework designed to avoid admitting the obvious. Captured documents and later accounts would make this clear. American involvement was tracked, discussed, and incorporated into planning by insurgent leadership. The fiction that the United States was merely assisting, rather than fighting, existed only on one side of the conflict. For the men on the ground, this reality was impossible to ignore. They were being shot at. They were being targeted deliberately. They were being killed because they represented American involvement, not because of any misunderstanding about their role. The war did not begin when Congress passed resolutions or when headlines changed tone. It began when Americans became targets in a conflict they were already shaping. By pretending otherwise, the United States allowed the enemy to set the terms of early engagement. The insurgents acted if the war had started, because for them, it had. The refusal to acknowledge that Americans were dying in a war did not come from ignorance. It came from calculation. Washington understood what was happening in Vietnam, but understanding did not automatically translate into admission. The political cost of honesty was simply too high. The shadow of Korea loomed over every discussion of Southeast Asia. That war had begun with limited objectives and ended in stalemate, costing tens of thousands of American lives and enormous political capital. Another open-ended conflict in Asia was not something elected officials were eager to explain to a weary public. At the same time, allowing South Vietnam to collapse carried its own risks. The spread of communism, particularly in Asia, was viewed as an existential threat. Failing to act would invite criticism of weakness. Acting openly risked backlash at home. The advisory mission offered a way to split the difference. By framing the involvement as assistance rather than war, policymakers bought time. They could support an ally, gather intelligence, and influence events without triggering congressional oversight or public debate. Casualties could be managed quietly. Escalation could happen incrementally. Language became a strategic tool. Deaths were not casualties of war. They were losses incurred during training missions or advisory duties. Hostile engagements were incidents, not battles. Each euphemism served to delay a reckoning. This approach relied on one assumption, that the cost would remain low enough to control. As long as deaths occurred one at a time, scattered across years and regions, they would not demand national attention. The system was designed to absorb loss without forcing change. But this strategy came at a human cost. Advisors operated under increasingly dangerous conditions without the protections, resources, or clarity that come with an acknowledged war. Decisions about risk were made in political vacuum, disconnected from the realities faced by those executing the mission. Washington looked away, not because it did not know, but because knowing and admitting were two very different things. Admitting the truth would have required explaining why Americans were dying in a country the nation was supposedly not fighting in. The longer denial lasted, the more entrenched it became. Each unacknowledged death made it harder to draw a clean line between peace and war. Each avoided debate ensured that when the admission finally came, it would arrive too late to prevent catastrophe. By the time the Vietnam War was formally acknowledged, the reality on the ground had already outpaced the narrative by years. American advisors had been killed, intelligence operations had expanded, insurgent forces had adapted to a foreign presence that Washington still described as limited and temporary. The moment chosen to reset the story came in August 1964 with the Gulf of Tonkin incidents. Whatever the ambiguity surrounding those events, their political value was clear. They provided a clean starting line, a moment that could be pointed to as the beginning of open conflict. Resolutions followed, troop deployments increased, language shifted. The United States was now at war. What changed was not the nature of American involvement, but its acknowledgement. The deaths that occurred before Tonkin did not disappear, but they were absorbed into a new timeline. Early advisors became footnotes. Their losses were overshadowed by the scale of casualties that followed. The war, as it came to be remembered, began with helicopters and battalions, not with advisors riding in unarmored vehicles on jungle roads. This reframing served a purpose. It allowed policymakers to present escalation as a response to a specific event rather than the culmination of years of quiet involvement. It simplified the story for public consumption. It also erased the uncomfortable truth that Americans had already been dying in Vietnam long before the country was prepared to admit it. For those who had served early, the shift was jarring. What they had experienced was now being described as something different, something preliminary, something less real. The risk they had accepted was retroactively minimized by the narrative that followed. History often prefers clean lines. Wars begin on dates, causes are assigned, timelines are drawn, but Vietnam refused to conform to that structure. It crept forward, step by step, advisor by advisor, death by death, until the fiction of non-involvement collapsed under its own weight. When the war officially began, it did not mark the start of American sacrifice. It marked the moment when sacrifice could no longer be denied. Wars rarely begin with the clarity that history later assigns them. They emerge gradually, shaped by decisions made quietly and justified carefully. In Vietnam, the first Americans to die did so in a conflict their own government refused to name. These men were not symbols. They were individuals with assignments, families, and orders that placed them in harm's way before the country was ready to acknowledge the cost. They trained units, rode patrols, advised commanders, and lived inside a war that officially did not exist. When they were killed, their deaths were absorbed into language designed to make them easier to accept and harder to question. The story of these early advisors is not about assigning blame in hindsight. It's about recognizing how political convenience can distort reality, and how that distortion carries consequences for the people asked to execute policy on the ground. By the time the United States admitted it was at war in Vietnam, the line between assistance and combat had already been crossed many times over. The names that came before the date matter because they reveal how wars actually begin, not with declarations or resolutions, but with small decisions that place lives at risk while avoiding accountability. Each unacknowledged death made the next one easier to ignore. Each avoided debate pushed the country further down the path it claimed not to be on. Remembering these men does not change the outcome of the Vietnam War, but it does change how we understand its origins. It forces us to confront the uncomfortable truth that sacrifice often precedes honesty, and that the cost of delay is measured in lives. The Vietnam War did not start when it was announced. It started when Americans began dying for a policy that could not yet admit what it had become. And those names deserve to be remembered, not as footnotes, but as the beginning of a war nobody was willing to admit had already begun. I'm Dave. I appreciate you watching. Please subscribe, like, comment, and share. And until next time, stand tall.
Oh, Dave.